All right, guys, as promised on Friday, we are going to spend a little bit of time today exploring the concept of classical conditioning. Okay, I just had you complete an activity with a partner. That activity is based on the concepts of classical conditioning. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about it, and then when this lecture video is over, you're going to go back to the activity. You're going to flip to the back of the sheet that had the instructions on it, and you're going to complete the two organizers that are there. Okay, so with that, classical conditioning is one of the two types of associative learning that we're going to talk about, right? And remember, associative learning is when two things are connected or linked together. In the case of classical conditioning, it is two stimuli that are linked together to elicit a learned response. So classical conditioning is about what happens before a behavior or before a response, okay? So we already did that little experiment. We're doing things out of order since I'm out of class with you guys today, okay? So with that, you are not recording this slide, but I just do want to remind you about Ivan Pavlov, because he's like the father of classical conditioning, and he didn't even do it on purpose. He just fell upon it, right? So you do need to know who Ivan Pavlov is, but not these specifics, right? So remember, he was a Russian physician and neurophysiologist, right? He was studying digestion, and he actually accidentally came upon classical conditioning, right? So while he was studying this salivation and the digestion in dogs, he noticed that like his dogs like started to salivate before he ever gave them any food. And so with that, a new research question kind of like popped up in his mind, and he really wanted to know like, why was that happening? Like what process was going, and thus he designed his well-known, famous dog salivation study. So when we looked at that salivation, basically, right, what was happening is, or what Pavlov ended up doing, is he noticed, right, that the natural thing, an unconditioned stimulus, is food. Dogs automatically, right, the unconditioned response, the normal response when a dog is presented with food is for a dog to salivate, okay, right? So that's normal, right? Your unconditioned stimulus produces an unconditioned response, right? Something naturally causes a response to happen, okay? Then he looked at something that was a neutral stimulus, meaning that stimulus did not produce the response. In this case, he did it with a tone in one of the variants of his study, okay? So then what he started to do was to pair the neutral stimulus or the tone with the food. And he repeated this several times, right? Neutral stimulus, food, and the dog would salivate. Neutral stimulus, food, and the dog would salivate. Okay, after several pairings, he decided to see, well, what would happen if he presented just the tone? And he found that when he presented the tone, the dog did in fact salivate, right? Which is weird because dogs don't naturally salivate to tones. So now the tone, which had been neutral previously or did not cause salivation, okay, was a conditioned stimulus and thus created a conditioned response, right? Because it's not normal for a dog to salivate. So with that, let's break down those four or five concepts that I was just using when I was talking about the dog, right? So our unconditioned stimulus is the thing that naturally or automatically triggers or leads to a particular response, right? So in the Pavlov instance, food naturally and automatically causes the dog to salivate, okay? So again, the second thing, our unconditioned response is the reaction that occurs naturally, right, to the unconditioned stimulus, okay? So unconditioned just means natural. There is no learning. It is the thing that automatically occurs, okay, right? Your neutral stimulus is the thing that does not get the response before conditioning or before training. It is the thing that eventually becomes the conditioned stimulus after enough times of pairing it, right? So the tone in the Pavlov experiment, after you paired tone food so many times, that neutral stimulus of the tone became the conditioned stimulus, right? Makes sense, okay? And therefore, the response that the subject had to the now conditioned stimulus is the conditioned response, right? Typically, your conditioned response and your unconditioned response are the same or a very, very similar based behavior. Okay. Again, just a reminder, anytime you watch these videos, you've got control of the push, pause, stop button. So if I move on before you're ready, then just pause the video, finish, and then restart the video. Okay. So again, a couple of other terms. We've already covered acquisition and extinction, right? Acquisition is the initial learning. So in classical conditioning, it is when the neutral stimuli becomes conditioned and elicits a response. Okay. Extinction is when that response goes away. So what would happen is if you continue to present the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned one, eventually the association is broken. Okay, so an extinction in classical conditioning is when the association between the two stimuli breaks. So if Pavlov presented the tone repeatedly, eventually the dog is not going to associate the tone with food, and then the dog will quit salivating. Okay. When we look at generalization, this is when a subject can't distinguish the difference between similar stimuli. And again, you don't need to write down the blue text. I just used it to help exemplify what the concept means, right? So if Pavlov used a tone, right, like the tuning fork you saw in the picture, to train the dog, but then the dog also salivated to like a regular dinging bell, that would be generalization because the dog couldn't tell the difference. So it's when the conditioned response occurs to a similar stimuli that is not the trained stimuli. Okay, discrimination then is the flip side of that. It is when the dog could distinguish, or you could distinguish the difference between two things, right? This also happens when we talk about other types of learning. Generalization is when you apply one thing to a larger concept or things that are similar, and discrimination is when you can tell the distinct differences between each individual.